The obese girl father sold her to a fur trading company until the mountain man bought out the entire company to free her. The Missouri River trading post sat like a rotting tooth at the edge of civilization, its log walls blackened by years of smoke and neglect. Charlotte Finch pressed her swollen hands against the tanning vat, the acrid stench of lye and urine burning her nostrils as she worked the heavy paddle through the putrid mixture. Her arms trembled with exhaustion. 16 hours into her shift, with 8 more to go before the overseers would allow her to collapse onto the moldy straw in the workers' barracks. At 22, Charlotte had once been the daughter of Thomas Finch, a respected fur trader who had built a modest fortune along the frontier. She remembered summers spent learning mathematics in her father's study, her fingers stained with ink as she balanced his ledgers with a precision that made him beam with pride. Those memories felt like someone else's life now. The sound of boots on wooden planks made her flinch. Josiah Creek, the head overseer, circled her workstation like a vulture assessing carrion. He was a skeletal man with yellowed teeth and breath that reeked of whiskey and decay. "You're falling behind quota again, girl," he said, his voice a wet rasp. "That's the 3rd time this week." Charlotte's jaw clenched. The quota was impossible, designed to fail. She knew it, Creek knew it, and every other bonded laborer in the Rocky Mountain Fur Company compound knew it. The quotas existed solely to justify punishment. "I've processed 43 hides today, Mr. Creek, the same as yesterday." Her voice was steady, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Creek's hand shot out, gripping her hair and yanking her head back. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm stating facts." Charlotte's eyes watered, but she held his gaze. The ledger by the door, shows. The blow caught her across the cheek, splitting her lip. She tasted copper and salt. Creek released her hair, letting her stumble against the vat. The caustic mixture splashed onto her already chemical-burned forearms, and she bit back a scream. "Facts?" Creek circled her again, flexing his fingers. "Here's a fact. Your daddy signed a contract selling your labor to this company for 5 years. We own every breath you take until that debt is paid. And the way you work, that'll be never." It was a lie. Charlotte had read the contract her father signed in that desperate final hour before he put a pistol to his head. 2 years of bonded labor to cover $300 in debt. She'd been here 19 months. But when she tried to argue the point with the company's superintendent, he'd simply laughed and produced a different document, one showing her father owed $3,000 with compound interest that grew faster than she could work. Creek grabbed her wrist, twisting until she cried out. "Maybe you need a reminder of your place." "Let her go." The voice cut through the compound like winter wind, cold, quiet, and carrying the promise of violence. Creek's head snapped around. The man in the doorway stood well over 6 feet, dressed in buckskins that had seen hard use but were meticulously maintained. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and his face was weathered by sun and wind into something that looked carved from stone. But it was his eyes that made Charlotte's breath catch, pale gray, assessing everything with the patient calculation of a predator. He carried a massive bundle of pelts over one shoulder, as if they weighed nothing. "This ain't your concern, stranger," Creek said, though he released Charlotte's wrist. "Company business." "Samuel Grant." The stranger set down the pelts with practiced care. "I'm here to sell, but I don't do business with men who beat women." Creek's laugh was sharp and mean. "That's rich. She's company property, bought and paid for. You can't touch her." Samuel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air, a tightening that made the other workers in the compound quietly back away from their stations. "Property," Samuel repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "What's the price to buy her contract?" Creek's eyes lit up with greedy interest. $500, cash." Charlotte's stomach dropped. $500 was a fortune, more than most men saw in 5 years of trapping. It was an impossible sum, meant to keep her exactly where she was. Samuel walked closer, his boots barely making sound on the packed earth floor. He stopped 5 feet from Creek, and despite the overseer's bluster, Charlotte saw him shift his weight backward unconsciously. "I didn't ask what you wanted to charge," Samuel said. "I asked what the price was. There's a difference. 500 is the price. Take it or what's the price to buy the entire company?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Creek's mouth worked soundlessly. Charlotte felt her pulse hammer in her throat. "You're mad," Creek finally managed. "The Rocky Mountain Fur Company is worth—" "I know what it's worth." Samuel's gaze hadn't left Creek's face. "I've been trapping these mountains for 12 years. I know every trading post from here to the Snake River. I know this company is bleeding money because of incompetent management and corruption. I also know exactly how much it would cost to acquire controlling interest." He turned to look at Charlotte for the first time. His eyes traveled over her bruised face, her chemical-burned arms, the iron shackle marks on her ankles. When he looked back at Creek, something terrible and cold had entered his expression. "Get your superintendent. Tell him Samuel Grant wants to discuss acquisition terms, and if she has so much as a scratch on her when I come back, I'll gut you like a beaver and leave you for the crows." Creek swallowed hard. He recognized the name. Everyone in the fur trade knew Samuel Grant, the mountain man who disappeared into the Rockies for months at a time and emerged with pelts of such quality that traders fought for his business. The man who'd survived 3 winters alone after his entire trapping party was killed by Blackfeet. The man who, rumor said, had killed 7 river pirates with nothing but a knife when they'd tried to rob his boat. I'll fetch Mr. Caldwell," Creek muttered, backing toward the door. Samuel waited until the overseer disappeared before approaching Charlotte. He moved carefully, the way one might approach a wounded animal. "Can you stand on your own?" His voice had gentled, but lost none of its certainty. Charlotte nodded, pride keeping her spine straight despite the pain. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." He studied her face. "But you're strong. I can see that. What's your name?" "Charlotte Finch." Recognition flickered across his features. "Thomas Finch's daughter? You knew my father?" "Met him once, 6 years ago at a rendezvous. He was a good man, honest trader." Samuel's jaw tightened. "What happened?" Charlotte's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the vat. "Bad investments, a partner who disappeared with half the capital. When everything collapsed, he couldn't bear it. The shame, the failure." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He shot himself in his study. I found him." Samuel's eyes closed briefly. "And the company claimed his debt. They said he owed $3,000. I tried to argue, but they had documents, signatures." She shook her head. "I don't know what was real anymore." "Everything about this place is poison," Samuel said quietly. "But that's going to change." 3 months later, Charlotte stood in the corner of Superintendent Caldwell's office, her role ostensibly to serve tea, but actually to be displayed as property, a reminder of Caldwell's power. She'd learned to make herself invisible during these meetings, to listen without seeming to hear. But today was different. Today, Samuel Grant sat across from Caldwell with papers spread between them, and the superintendent's face had gone from ruddy confidence to ashen uncertainty over the course of the negotiation. "This is absurd," Caldwell blustered, his jowls quivering. "You're offering $12,000 for controlling interest? The company is worth 3 times that." "The company is worth exactly what someone will pay for it," Samuel said calmly. "And right now, I'm the only buyer. You're hemorrhaging money. Your accounts show losses for 8 consecutive quarters. Your reputation in the trading community is deteriorating because of quality issues. And I have documentation here," he tapped a sheaf of papers, "showing that 3 of your major creditors are preparing to call in their loans." Caldwell's eyes widened. "How did you—" "I spent 3 months doing what you should have done. Actual business. I spoke to every trader, every creditor, every competitor. I know exactly how close to collapse you are." Samuel leaned forward. $12,000, cash, For 51% of shares. You remain as superintendent, but I control the board. Take it, or watch your creditors tear this company apart and get nothing." Charlotte watched Caldwell's face cycle through rage, fear, and finally desperate calculation. She'd seen that expression before. It was the same look her father had worn in those final weeks. "You're a trapper," Caldwell said weakly. "What do you know about running a trading company?" Samuel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know how to track, how to hunt, how to wait, and most importantly, how to know when something is rotting from the inside." He stood, gathering his papers. "You have until sundown to decide. After that, I take my money to your competitors and help them build something better on your ruins." He walked out without looking back. Charlotte remained frozen in her corner as Caldwell sagged in his chair, reaching for the whiskey decanter with shaking hands. She knew he would accept. Men like Caldwell always chose survival over pride. At sundown, Samuel Grant became the majority owner of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. The morning after the sale, Charlotte stood in the compound yard with 43 other bonded laborers, shackles cutting into her ankles as they waited in the pre-dawn cold. Rumors had spread through the barracks all night, whispered speculation about what the new owner would mean for them. Samuel emerged from the main building with Caldwell trailing behind him like a whipped dog. In the growing light, Charlotte could see dark circles under the superintendent's eyes. He'd clearly spent the night drinking. Samuel addressed the assembled workers without preamble. "I'm Samuel Grant. As of yesterday, I own controlling interest in this company. Effective immediately, all bonded labor contracts are void." Silence. Then confused murmuring. "You're free," Samuel continued. "Every one of you. The shackles come off now. You'll each receive 2 weeks' wages based on fair market rates, plus transportation to wherever you want to go." Caldwell made a strangled sound. "You can't. The contracts are legal. The contracts are void because I say they are," Samuel said without looking at him. "I own the company. I make the rules. Anyone who doesn't like it can leave." Creek stepped forward from where he'd been standing with the other overseers. "You're destroying the business model. These people owe nothing." Samuel's voice went cold. "You, on the other hand, owe them. I've reviewed the actual ledgers, the real ones you kept hidden. You've been skimming profits, falsifying debt amounts, and pocketing the difference for years." Creek's face went white. "That's a lie." "I found 3 sets of books. The ones you showed investors, the ones you used for taxes, and the real accounts you kept in a locked box under your bed." Samuel pulled out a leather-bound ledger, holding it up. "Want me to read the entries out loud? Or should we discuss how Thomas Finch actually paid his debt in full 14 months before his daughter was sold into bondage?" Charlotte's world tilted. The other workers gasped. Creek lunged forward, reaching for the ledger, but Samuel sidestepped and delivered a precise blow to the overseer's solar plexus. Creek folded, gasping. "Charlotte Finch!" Samuel called out. She stepped forward on trembling legs, her shackles scraping. Samuel knelt and unlocked them himself, his movements gentle despite the barely contained violence radiating from him. When he stood, he handed her the ledger. "Your father paid his debt with a small gold strike he made 2 years ago. $347 worth of gold dust delivered to this office, receipted and recorded." He pointed to an entry. "Creek altered the books after your father's death. He and Caldwell fabricated the $3,000 debt because they discovered you had exceptional talent with numbers. They wanted to keep you here to exploit." Charlotte's hands shook as she read her father's name in the ledger, saw the receipt stamped "paid in full." Rage and grief crashed over her in equal measure. Her father had freed her, and then they'd stolen it from both of them. "You're all dismissed," Samuel told the other workers, "except you." He pointed at Creek and the 3 other overseers. "You're under arrest for fraud and false imprisonment." "The territorial marshal's on his way," Creek sneered despite his pain. "You think you can prove anything? We'll be out in a week, and when you are, you'll be broke," Samuel interrupted, "because I'm suing you personally for damages. Every penny you stole plus interest. Your homes, your land, your savings, all of it goes to the people you brutalized. Charlotte watched Creek's sneer falter. Around her, the other freed workers were crying, laughing, embracing, but she felt oddly hollow. Free, yes, but free to do what? Go where? As the compound erupted into chaos, people gathering belongings, overseers being bound for the marshal, Samuel approached her again. I meant what I said. You're free. If you want to leave, I'll provide money and transportation. Charlotte looked around at the compound that had been her prison. Then she looked at the ledger in her hands, her father's vindication and her own proof of worth. If I leave, I'll have nothing, she said quietly. No family, no home, no purpose. She met Samuel's eyes. At least here, I understand the work, the numbers, the books. Samuel studied her for a long moment. Can you do more than basic arithmetic? I managed my father's entire trading operation from the time I was 16. Profit projections, cost analysis, inventory management, trade route optimization. A bitter smile crossed her lips. That's why they wanted to keep me. I found a $3,000 accounting error my second week here. Creek couldn't let me leave after that. Samuel's expression shifted to something like respect. How would you feel about doing that again? But this time, you'd be paid. And you'd be management, not property. Charlotte's heart hammered. You'd trust me with your company? It's not about trust. It's about competence. Samuel gestured at the main building. Caldwell stays on in title only. I need someone who actually understands the books to run the daily operations. Someone who knows where the bodies are buried. Interested? For the first time in 19 months, Charlotte felt something like hope kindle in her chest. What's the salary? Samuel named a figure that made her eyes widen. It was more than many men made in a year. And I want it in writing, she added. A proper contract, not a bond, not an indenture, an actual employment agreement. Samuel held out his hand. Deal. Charlotte shook it, feeling calluses against her own work-roughened palm. His grip was firm but not crushing, the grasp of an equal. One more thing, Samuel said as he released her hand. I'll be gone most of the time. Trapping runs take months. I need to know you can handle the company without me looking over your shoulder. I can, Charlotte said with more confidence than she'd felt in years. But I'll need access to everything, all the books, all the records, all the supplier contracts. If I'm going to fix this mess, I need to see the full extent of the damage. It's all yours. Samuel turned to leave, then paused. Charlotte, thank you for staying. Most people would have run. Most people didn't spend 19 months learning to stand their ground, she replied. Samuel's rare smile appeared briefly. Fair point. Charlotte spent her first week as operations manager living in the company ledgers. She converted Caldwell's office into her workspace. The superintendent was now relegated to a smaller room, a change that brought her vicious satisfaction. The office had windows overlooking the compound, and she had had them cleaned for the first time in years, letting light pour across the pages of accounts. What she found made her father's falsified debt look like petty theft. The embezzlement ran deeper than anyone suspected. Creek and Caldwell hadn't just been skimming. They'd been running an entire shadow operation. Furs that were supposed to go to legitimate buyers were being diverted to black market traders. Supply shipments were being marked as delivered but sold elsewhere. Workers' wages were inflated on paper with the difference pocketed. And there were names, powerful names, traders in St. Louis, officials in the territorial government, men who'd been receiving kickbacks for years. Charlotte worked 18-hour days, sometimes sleeping at her desk. She cross-referenced shipping manifests with inventory records, compared purchase orders to actual deliveries, traced payment chains through multiple intermediary accounts. Her mathematical mind, sharpened by years of working with her father and then beaten into ruthless efficiency by the need to survive quotas, devoured the corruption. 6 months after taking over the books, she had it all mapped out. The company wasn't just bleeding money. It had been deliberately gutted from within, a carcass being picked clean by scavengers. She was compiling the final evidence when Samuel returned from his fall trapping run. He walked into her office at twilight, snow dusting his shoulders, carrying a bundle of beaver pelts that would have made most traders salivate. Charlotte looked up from her desk, startled. She'd been so absorbed that she hadn't heard him arrive. "You look terrible," Samuel said bluntly. "When did you last sleep?" "Yesterday? Maybe." Charlotte rubbed her eyes. "What day is it?" "Thursday." He set down the pelts and moved to her desk, studying the papers spread across its surface. His eyes widened as he took in the scope of what she'd uncovered. Jesus Christ. "It's worse than we thought." Charlotte's voice was hoarse from disuse. She'd barely spoken to anyone in weeks. They weren't just stealing from the company. They were using it as a front for a smuggling operation. Illegal whiskey to Indian territories, stolen army supplies, even guns. Samuel's jaw tightened as he read through her documentation. How much? Conservative estimate, $73,000 over the past 8 years. Charlotte pulled out a master ledger she'd created. "I can prove every transaction. I have bills of lading, forged receipts, witness statements from workers who thought they were just following orders." 73,000, Samuel repeated quietly. That's more than the entire company's worth. Yes. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her now that someone else was finally here to share the burden. They were going to run it into the ground, declare bankruptcy, and walk away with the money. If you hadn't bought it when you did, this whole compound would have been liquidated by spring. Samuel pulled up a chair, his movements deliberate. "Who else knows about this?" "Just you and me. I haven't even told the workers. I wasn't sure," she hesitated. "These names. Some of them are dangerous men. If they know we have this evidence..." "They'll come for us," Samuel finished. "For you, specifically. You're the one who can testify to what these documents mean." Charlotte had been trying not to think about that, but hearing it said aloud made the fear coil tighter in her gut. "What do we do?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers. "We burn it all down, but we do it smart. We get the territorial marshal involved, the Federal Trade Commission, maybe even the Army if the weapon smuggling is as extensive as you think." "That could take months," Charlotte said, "maybe years, and in the meantime..." A crash from downstairs cut her off. Shouts, the sound of breaking glass. Samuel was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the long knife at his belt. "Stay here." Like hell, Charlotte grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace. It wasn't much, but it was something. They moved to the office door together. Samuel cracked it open, peering into the hallway. Charlotte could smell smoke now, acrid and chemical, not wood fire. "Oil fire," Samuel said quietly. "Someone's burning the building." Of course, Charlotte's stomach sank. They want to destroy the evidence? "And probably kill us in the process." Samuel glanced at her. "There's a back stairs. We can..." The door at the end of the hall exploded inward. 7 men poured through, led by Josiah Creek. He should have been in jail, but apparently someone had posted his bail. His face was twisted with rage and something darker. Desperation. "You stupid bitch," Creek snarled, advancing toward them. "You should have taken the freedom and run. Should have kept your head down." Samuel stepped in front of Charlotte. "You won't touch her." "You?" Creek laughed, a harsh sound. "You're 1 man, Grant. We're 7, and we've got friends who are very interested in seeing those ledgers burn." "Then come take them." Samuel's voice was utterly calm. Creek gestured, and his men spread out in the narrow hallway. They had clubs. One had a pistol. Behind them, Charlotte could hear the fire spreading, eating through the dry wood of the building. Samuel glanced back at her, and in his eyes she saw calculation rather than fear. "Charlotte, the window behind my desk. Can you reach the warehouse roof from there?" She understood immediately. He was giving her an escape route. "I'm not leaving you. You have to. The evidence..." Is memorized, Charlotte interrupted. Every transaction, every name, every date. I have a photographic memory. It's how I survived my father's lessons when I was a child. She gripped the poker tighter. They'll have to kill us both to keep me quiet. Something like pride flickered across Samuel's face. Then he moved. Charlotte had seen bar fights. She'd seen rough men throw drunken punches. What Samuel did wasn't fighting. It was controlled violence, precise as surgery. He caught the first man's club arm, twisted it until bones snapped, and used the screaming man as a shield against the second attacker. The pistol fired, the ball catching the human shield in the shoulder. Samuel shoved the wounded man into the shooter, sending both crashing into the wall. Charlotte saw Creek circling, trying to get around Samuel to her. She didn't think, just swung the poker with all her strength at his knee. The crack was audible even over the shouting. Creek went down screaming. Charlotte brought the poker down again, this time on his hand as he reached for her. More bones broke. The hallway became chaos. Samuel was a whirlwind, his knife appearing in his hand as if conjured. He moved with the economy of a predator, no wasted motion. 2 more men went down, clutching bleeding wounds, but there were too many, and the smoke was getting thicker. Charlotte's eyes watered, her lungs burned. Creek, still on the floor, was crawling toward her with murder in his eyes. Charlotte raised the poker. Samuel's boot caught Creek in the temple. The overseer went limp. "Now we run," Samuel said, grabbing Charlotte's hand. They raced down the back stairs, the building groaning around them. Behind them, the remaining attackers gave chase, but they were slowed by their wounded. Samuel and Charlotte burst out into the compound yard, gasping in the cold night air. The main office building was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the stars. Workers were forming bucket brigades, but it was too late. The structure was lost. Charlotte watched her 6 months of work burning, felt the heat on her face, and instead of despair, she felt something wild and fierce bloom in her chest. "The evidence is gone." "The physical evidence," Samuel corrected, breathing hard. "But you said you memorized it." "Every word." Samuel turned to look at her, his face lit by the dancing flames. He had blood on his hands, a gash on his forehead, and his eyes were bright with battle fury. "Then we make them regret teaching you to read." Behind them, the building collapsed with a roar. Sparks spiraled into the night sky like angry stars. Charlotte thought of her father, of the ledger that had vindicated him now turned to ash. But the truth of what had been done to him, to her, to all of them, that lived on in her memory, precise and damning. "They'll come after us again," she said. "Yes," Samuel agreed. "They will." "Good." Charlotte met his gaze. "I want them to." The territorial marshal arrived 3 days after the fire. Marshal James Wilson was a hard man in his 50s, weathered by frontier justice and skeptical of everything. He listened to Charlotte's testimony with increasing disbelief, taking notes in a cramped, careful hand. "Ma'am, what you're describing is a criminal conspiracy involving some of the most powerful men in Missouri Territory," he said when she finished. "Without physical evidence—" "I have witnesses," Charlotte interrupted. 43 former bonded laborers who can testify to the working conditions. I have bank records showing unusual transfers. Those survived the fire because they're held by the banks themselves. And I have this." She slid across the table a document she'd painstakingly recreated from memory, a complete map of the smuggling operation, with dates, locations, and names. Wilson studied it, his expression darkening. "How can you possibly remember all this?" "The same way I remembered every mathematical formula my father taught me, every trade route, every market price." Charlotte's voice was steady. "My mind retains numbers and patterns. It's a gift that's caused me nothing but trouble." "If even half of this is true," Wilson looked up at her. "These men will kill you rather than let you testify. You understand that?" "They already tried," Samuel said from where he leaned against the wall. "They'll try again, which is why we're not waiting around for them." Wilson frowned. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we hunt them," Samuel said simply. Track them down one by one, gather evidence, and drag them before a federal court. Charlotte can identify every transaction, every player. I can track them through the wilderness if they run. Together, we can build a case that won't fall apart in court. That's vigilante justice, Wilson protested. No, Charlotte said. It's bringing criminals to justice when the system has failed. Creek and Caldwell posted bail and disappeared. The men who backed them are still operating freely. How long before they destroy more lives? Wilson was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, I can't officially sanction this. Understood, Samuel replied. But if a concerned citizen happened to gather evidence and bring it to my attention, Wilson stood, tucking his notes into his coat. I'd be obligated to investigate. And if that evidence led to federal charges, well, that would be outside my jurisdiction anyway. After the marshal left, Charlotte and Samuel sat in the temporary office they'd set up in the warehouse, one of the few buildings untouched by the fire. Are you sure about this? Samuel asked. Once we start, there's no turning back. These men won't just come after you. They'll target anyone you care about. Charlotte thought about that. Who did she care about? Her father was dead. She had no siblings, no extended family that had bothered to contact her after her bonding. The workers she'd freed were scattered to the winds. There was only Samuel. I don't have anyone they can hurt, she said, except you. And somehow I think you can take care of yourself. Samuel smiled, but it was a grim expression. I've survived worse. But Charlotte, this isn't just about revenge. You need to understand that. Once we expose this corruption, it'll change the entire trading economy in the territory. People who thought they were working with legitimate companies will lose investments. Families might be ruined. Good, Charlotte said flatly. They built their fortunes on the backs of people like me, people who were tricked, trapped, and brutalized. If their wealth was built on a lie, it deserves to burn. Samuel studied her face, the determination that had replaced the fear he'd first seen in the tanning compound. You've changed. I've stopped pretending to be small, Charlotte replied. They taught me that. When you're in chains, you learn exactly how much strength you actually have. Over the next 3 months, Charlotte and Samuel became ghosts, haunting the Missouri Territory's criminal underworld. They would appear in a river town, Charlotte posing as a bookkeeper looking for work while Samuel played the part of a simple trapper. They'd gain access to trading companies, banks, shipping offices. And Charlotte would spend hours memorizing records, her photographic memory creating perfect copies that could later be testified to in court. They discovered that the corruption ran deeper than anyone suspected. Creek and Caldwell had been small fish in a vast network. The real power lay with 3 men: Silas Blackwood, who owned half the riverboat traffic on the Missouri; Augustus Pemberton, a banker in St. Louis; and Colonel Richard Ashford, who was supposedly in charge of preventing exactly the kind of smuggling he was actually facilitating. These men had built an empire on human misery. Charlotte found records of dozens of bonded laborers like herself, people trapped in impossible debt, worked to death, their labor stolen while corrupt officials looked the other way. The work was dangerous. Twice they barely escaped when their cover was blown. Once, Charlotte had to hide in a warehouse loft for 8 hours, while Creek and a gang of hired thugs searched for them below. She'd watched Samuel lead them on a chase through the woods, drawing them away from her, and spent those hours praying he'd survive. He always did. Samuel had a frontiersman's cunning and a warrior's skill. But Charlotte noticed that each close call took its toll. He developed a tension in his shoulders that never quite left, a way of scanning every room for exits, for weapons, for threats. They were living in constant danger, and it was changing them both. 4 months into their hunt, they were staying in a boarding house in a small settlement along the river. Charlotte was working by candlelight, compiling her notes, when Samuel returned from a scouting trip. He looked exhausted. "Blackwood knows we're coming," he said without preamble. "He's hired protection, real professionals, not thugs like Creek's men." Charlotte set down her pen. How many? At least a dozen. Former Army scouts, some of them. Samuel poured himself a whiskey from the bottle they kept for occasions that required it. They're not going to make this easy. We've handled worse. No, we haven't. Samuel drained the glass. Charlotte, this is different. These men are trained killers. If we go after Blackwood directly, there's a real chance one or both of us won't walk away. Then we don't go directly, Charlotte said. We do what we've been doing. We gather evidence, we turn it over to Marshal Wilson, we let the law handle it. The law has been handling it, Samuel said bitterly, and Creek is still free. Caldwell disappeared into the wilderness. For all our work, how many of them have actually faced justice? Charlotte understood his frustration because she felt it too. They'd exposed corruption, yes. They'd helped shut down several illegal operations. But the men at the top remained untouchable, protected by money and influence. We need something bigger, Charlotte said slowly, an idea forming. Not just evidence of crimes, we need to hit them where it actually hurts. Their money, Samuel said, seeing where she was going. Exactly. All this corruption, it's built on cash flow. Blackwood needs the smuggling profits to pay his protection, to bribe officials, to maintain his empire. If we cut off the money, the whole thing collapses, Samuel finished. His eyes gleamed. You're talking about financial warfare. Charlotte smiled, and it was not a kind expression. I'm talking about doing to them exactly what they did to my father, destroying their credit, exposing their fraudulent dealings, making them radioactive to legitimate business. Can you do that? Give me access to their bank records in 2 weeks. I can bankrupt all 3 of them without firing a shot. Samuel laughed, a genuine sound of delight. God, you're terrifying. I had good teachers. Charlotte stood, moving to the window. Outside, the river rolled past, dark and vast. But we'll need leverage, something to force the banks to cooperate. I might know someone, Samuel said thoughtfully. A trader I knew years ago. He's a bank examiner now for the federal government. If we can show him evidence of fraud, he can compel the banks to open their records. Then that's our next move. Charlotte turned back to face him. We stop chasing these men through the wilderness. We attack them from inside their own system. Samuel raised his glass in a toast. To financial ruin. Charlotte clinked her teacup against it. The most permanent kind. Mons, the federal bank examiner, Thomas Whitmore, was a meticulous man who believed in the sanctity of proper accounting. When Charlotte spread her evidence before him, testimony she could recite verbatim, patterns of fraudulent transfers, ghost accounts and shell companies, his hands trembled with outrage. My God, this is systemic, he breathed, studying her documentation. These banks have been facilitating criminal activity for years. Can you compel them to open their full records? Charlotte asked. I can shut them down entirely if necessary, Whitmore said grimly. But I need your testimony under oath, all of it. Can you do that? Every transaction, every date, every amount. Charlotte met his eyes. I'm ready. The depositions took 3 weeks. Charlotte sat in a federal office in St. Louis and recited from memory the contents of hundreds of documents. Clerks scrambled to keep up with her testimony. Lawyers tried to catch her in inconsistencies and failed. Her memory was perfect, her understanding of the financial structures complete, and with each day of testimony, the net drew tighter around Blackwood, Pemberton, and Ashford. Whitmore moved fast once he had enough evidence. Federal marshals seized bank records. Trading companies were shut down pending investigation. Assets were frozen. Within a month, the 3 architects of the smuggling empire saw their financial foundations crumbling. But wounded predators are the most dangerous kind. Charlotte was walking back to her boarding house after a long day of testimony when the carriage pulled up beside her. She had just enough time to register the door opening before hands grabbed her, yanking her inside. A cloth pressed over her face, chloroform. She struggled, but consciousness faded. When she woke, she was in a warehouse, hands bound to a chair. Her head pounded and her vision swam. As it cleared, she saw three men standing before her: Blackwood, Pemberton, and Ashford. Blackwood was a heavy man in his 50s, expensively dressed with the soft hands of someone who'd never done physical labor. Pemberton was thin and nervous, constantly adjusting his spectacles. Ashford still wore his uniform, every button polished, his bearing military perfect despite his corruption. "Miss Finch," Blackwood said pleasantly, "you've cost us a great deal of money." Charlotte tested her bonds, tight but not impossible. "Good. Defiant to the end. How admirable." Blackwood circled her chair. "You understand that you're not leaving this warehouse alive?" "I understand that you're stupid enough to kidnap a federal witness during an active investigation," Charlotte replied. "The marshals will tear this territory apart looking for me." "The marshals will find your body in the river," Ashford said coldly. "A tragic accident. You'll have drowned during an evening walk." "And your precious testimony," Pemberton added, his voice shaking. "Without you to verify it, it's hearsay, inadmissible." Charlotte almost pitied them. They still didn't understand. "You really haven't been paying attention. I gave my testimony under oath. It's recorded, witnessed, legal. Killing me doesn't erase it." Blackwood's pleasant expression cracked. "Then why—" "Revenge," Charlotte said simply. "You want me dead because I destroyed you. But go ahead. Prove me right about what kind of men you are." Ashford pulled out a pistol. "Enough of this. We should—" The warehouse door exploded inward. Samuel came through it like a force of nature, his rifle firing before the door finished splintering. Ashford went down, the pistol flying from his hand. Blackwood dove behind a crate. Pemberton froze, paralyzed by fear. But they weren't alone. The hired killers Blackwood had warned about poured in from the side doors, a dozen armed men. Samuel dove behind a pile of cargo as bullets tore through the air. Charlotte threw herself backward, tipping her chair over and rolling behind a barrel. Her hands were still bound, but she managed to hook them on a broken piece of metal jutting from a crate and started sawing at the ropes. The warehouse became a war zone. Samuel was outnumbered, but fighting with desperate precision. He'd positioned himself to control the main approach, using cargo as cover, firing carefully to conserve ammunition. But there were too many of them. Charlotte got one hand free, then the other. She looked around frantically for something, anything she could use. Her eyes landed on the kerosene lamps hanging from the rafters. "Samuel!" she shouted. "Get to the door!" He looked at her, understood immediately, and began fighting his way back toward the entrance. Charlotte grabbed a lamp and threw it at the nearest pile of cargo. It smashed, oil spreading. She grabbed another and another, creating a ring of fire around the warehouse interior. The dry wood caught instantly, flames roaring to life. Blackwood's men scattered, caught between the fire and Samuel's rifle. In the chaos, Charlotte ran for the door. Samuel provided covering fire, dropping two more men before his rifle clicked empty. They burst out into the night together, the warehouse burning behind them. Inside, men were screaming, some from bullets, some from flames. Charlotte and Samuel ran until they reached the river, then collapsed on the bank, gasping for air. "You burned them," Samuel said between breaths. "They wanted to burn my testimony," Charlotte replied. "Seemed fair." Behind them, the warehouse was an inferno. They could hear the fire brigade arriving, but it was too late. The structure was lost. Samuel started laughing, a wild, exhausted sound. Charlotte joined him, the release of tension making her giddy despite the danger they'd just survived. "We're alive," she said wonderingly. "We're alive," Samuel agreed. He pulled her close, and Charlotte let herself lean against him, feeling his heartbeat against her cheek. It was racing as fast as her own. They stayed like that, watching the fire, until the marshals arrived. Marshal Wilson arrested what was left of Blackwood's organization within the week. Ashford had survived his wound and was singing like a canary to save his own skin. Pemberton had died in the fire. Blackwood himself was pulled from the burning warehouse with severe burns and was now in custody, facing decades in prison. The trial became the scandal of the territory. Charlotte testified for 3 days, her perfect recall destroying every defense the lawyers tried to mount. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty. On all counts. Charlotte stood in the courtroom as the verdict was read, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt something like peace. With the criminal network dismantled, Samuel and Charlotte returned to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. What they found was a mess. Months of neglect had left operations in shambles, but it was their mess now, and they set about rebuilding with the same intensity they'd brought to destroying their enemies. Charlotte restructured the entire business model. She ended the exploitative labor practices, instituted fair wages, and created a merit-based promotion system. She also diversified their investments, using recovered assets from the criminal trials to purchase interests in riverboat transportation and mineral exploration. Samuel brought his expertise in frontier trade, establishing relationships with native tribes based on fair dealing rather than exploitation. He taught the trappers modern techniques, created supply chains that benefited everyone involved, and built a reputation for honesty in a business known for deception. Within a year, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company was not just profitable. It was thriving. Within 2 years, it was the most successful trading operation in the territory. Charlotte became known as the Ledger Queen, a woman who could spot financial fraud from 100 paces and who ran her business with mathematical precision. Men who'd initially scoffed at taking orders from a woman learned quickly that underestimating Charlotte Finch was a fast route to bankruptcy. Samuel, meanwhile, became a legend of a different sort, the mountain man who'd bought a company to free one woman and ended up toppling an empire. Stories of his confrontation with Blackwood's men spread through the trading posts, growing more elaborate with each telling. But despite their success, something remained unspoken between them. They worked together perfectly. They trusted each other, absolutely. But they maintained a careful distance, each afraid to disturb the partnership that had become the foundation of their lives. That changed one winter evening, 18 months after the trial. Charlotte was working late in her office as usual. The company was expanding into new markets, and she was reviewing contracts by lamplight when Samuel knocked on her door. "It's past midnight," he said. "Even you need to sleep sometimes." "Says the man who once trapped for 3 months straight without returning to civilization," Charlotte replied, but she set down her pen. "What brings you by?" Samuel entered, and Charlotte noticed he was nervous, a rare state for a man who'd faced down river pirates and smugglers with steady calm. "I've been thinking," he began, then paused. "Charlotte, we've built something remarkable here, this company, this life, but we've built it as partners, as colleagues." Charlotte's heart started beating faster. "Yes? I don't want to be your colleague anymore." The world seemed to tilt. "Oh," Charlotte said quietly, "I see. You want to dissolve the partnership?" "No," Samuel interrupted, moving closer. "God, no. Charlotte, I want more. I want to build a life with you. Not just a business, a real life, together." Charlotte stared at him, her brilliant mind suddenly struggling to process words. "You're asking me to marry me?" "Yes." Samuel's voice was steady now, certain. "I know I'm not what most people would consider a good match. I'm rough, I'm half wild, I disappear into the mountains for months, but I love you. I've loved you since I watched you refuse to run when Creek came for you in that burning building. You're the strongest, smartest, most remarkable person I've ever known. And I want to spend the rest of my life watching you conquer the world." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd cried since her father's death. "Samuel, I'm not easy to love. I'm difficult. I'm demanding. I have a temper that could melt iron." "I know," Samuel said, smiling. "It's one of your best qualities. And I won't be anyone's property, not ever again." "I don't want to own you," Samuel said seriously. "I want to stand beside you, As an equal. Always. Charlotte stood, moving around the desk to face him directly. Then yes. Yes, I'll marry you. But on one condition. Name it. We write a marriage contract that explicitly states I retain control of my assets and business interests, that we are partners in law, not master and servant, that if you ever try to make decisions for me without consulting me, I have the right to hit you with the nearest blunt object. Samuel laughed. Deal. Though I reserve the right to point out when you're working yourself to exhaustion. Also acceptable. He pulled her close then, and Charlotte let herself melt into the embrace. It felt strange, wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. She'd spent so long being strong, being solitary, that allowing herself this vulnerability required a different kind of courage. I love you, she whispered against his chest. I think I have since you walked into that compound and treated me like a person instead of property. I love you, Samuel replied, and I promise to spend every day earning that love. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the trading post. The guest list was unusual. Former bonded laborers they'd freed, native traders Samuel had partnered with, Marshall Wilson, even Thomas Whitmore, the bank examiner. People who understood what they'd built together, what they'd survived. Charlotte wore a dress of deep blue silk, custom-made because nothing in the frontier settlements fit her properly. She didn't care. She felt beautiful because of the way Samuel looked at her, like she was the most precious thing in his world. The marriage contract they signed was revolutionary for its time. It granted Charlotte full legal control of her assets, equal say in business decisions, and explicit protection against any attempt to claim her property as her husband's. Several lawyers told them it would never hold up in court. Charlotte looked them dead in the eye and said, "Try me." Eager, no one ever did. 5 years after their marriage, Charlotte sat in the study of their new home, a proper house built overlooking the Missouri River, with windows that caught the sunset and enough space for the growing business and their growing family. Their daughter, Hope, was 3 years old and currently attempting to help her mother with the ledgers by drawing pictures in the margins. Charlotte had given up trying to stop her. The child had inherited her mother's gift for numbers and her father's stubborn determination, a combination that promised both brilliance and chaos. "Mama, what's this?" Hope pointed to a column of figures. "That's our profit from the riverboat trade this quarter," Charlotte explained. "See how the numbers go up? That means we're doing well." "We're always doing well," Hope said with the confidence of a child who'd never known want. "Papa says you're magic with numbers." Charlotte smiled. "Not magic, just practice." Samuel entered the study, shaking snow from his coat. He'd been in the city, meeting with investors about their latest venture, a railroad spur that would connect the frontier settlements to the growing eastern markets. "How did it go?" Charlotte asked. "They're interested, but nervous about investing in a company partially owned by a woman." Samuel's tone was dry. "I told them that was exactly why they should invest. You've never lost us money." "What did they say?" "They asked to meet you in person," Samuel grinned. "I think you terrify them." "Good." Charlotte stood, lifting Hope onto her hip. "Terrified investors are cautious investors. They'll read the contracts carefully and not try to cheat us." She carried their daughter to the window, looking out at the river they'd both fought so hard to survive. The trading post was still there, but transformed, now the headquarters of an empire that stretched from St. Louis to the Pacific, built on fairness and competence rather than exploitation. Charlotte thought about the girl she'd been, beaten, enslaved, certain she would die in those tanning vats. That girl would have been amazed to see what she'd become, the woman who'd rebuilt her father's legacy, the wife of a legendary mountain man, the mother of a child who'd never know what it meant to be powerless. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, coming to stand beside her. "That we won," Charlotte said simply. "We took everything they tried to use to destroy us and built something beautiful instead." Samuel wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close while Hope squirmed between them. "We did. and we'll keep winning every day. Charlotte leaned into him, watching the sun set over the water. Below them, workers were finishing their shifts, real shifts with fair pay and safe conditions. The compound that had been her prison was now a place where people chose to work, knowing they'd be treated justly. "Mama, Papa, can we go see the boats tomorrow?" Hope asked. "Of course," Charlotte said. "We'll inspect continuing the story continuation of Part 7. Legacy the operations together, show her how every piece of the business works." "She already understands it better than most of our managers," Samuel said with pride. Yesterday she explained the concept of compound interest to one of the clerks. "She's 3, Charlotte reminded him, but she was smiling. "She's our daughter, of course she's exceptional." They stood together at the window as darkness fell, the lamplight from the compound below creating pools of gold against the snow. Charlotte thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that first terrible moment when Samuel had walked into the tanning compound to this life they'd built together. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Everything you gave up to free me? The money, the peace, the simple life you had before?" Samuel turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Charlotte, I gave up $12,000 in 3 years of my life fighting corruption. What I gained was everything that matters, you, hope, a business that doesn't exploit people, a life with meaning beyond just survival." He cupped her face gently. "I'd do it again without hesitation. 1,000 times over." Charlotte kissed him, feeling hope squirm between them and giggle. "We should put this one to bed." "Story first?" Hope demanded. "Papa, tell me about the mountain lions." "Again?" Samuel groaned theatrically, but he was already lifting their daughter into his arms. "Fine, but after this one, sleep." Charlotte followed them to Hope's room, listening to Samuel embellish another tale of his trapping days. He was a natural storyteller, making the frontier come alive with his words. Hope hung on every syllable, her eyes wide. After their daughter finally fell asleep, Charlotte and Samuel returned to the study. There was always more work, contracts to review, expansion plans to finalize, correspondence to answer. But tonight, Charlotte found herself simply standing with Samuel at the window again, watching the river. "We're having another child," she said quietly. Samuel went very still. "What?" "I'm pregnant, about 3 months along." Charlotte placed his hand on her stomach. "I wanted to be certain before I told you." Samuel's face transformed, first shock, then joy so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He pulled her close, careful of her belly. "Charlotte, God, another child." "I thought you should know," she said against his chest. "Before we finalize the railroad deal, I'll need to adjust my travel schedule in the coming months." Samuel laughed, the sound shaky. "Leave it to you to announce a baby and immediately start planning logistics. Someone has to be practical." "I love you," Samuel said fiercely. "I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes." "I love you too," Charlotte replied, "even when you track mud through my clean office." "That was 1 time. 7 times. Who's counting?" "I am, always." Charlotte pulled back to look at him. "Samuel, I've been thinking about expanding into education." His eyebrows rose. "Education?" "There are dozens of children in this territory who will never learn to read, never learn mathematics, never have opportunities because there are no schools. We have the resources to change that." Charlotte's voice grew passionate. "We could build schools, hire teachers, offer scholarships for children whose families can't afford education. Make sure no one else loses opportunities because of poverty." Samuel studied her face. "This is about your father, isn't it? And you. It's about hope, and this new baby, and every child who deserves a chance." Charlotte's hand moved to her stomach. "I was lucky. My father taught me, gave me skills that saved my life. Most children, especially girls, don't get that. We could change that." "How much would it cost?" Charlotte had already run the numbers. "Initial investment of $10,000, ongoing operational costs of about $3,000 annually. We'd see no financial return. It would be pure philanthropy. Do it, Samuel said without hesitation. Just like that? Charlotte, you turned a failing trading company into an empire. You destroyed a criminal network. You rebuilt your father's legacy from ashes. Samuel smiled. If you want to revolutionize frontier education, I have no doubt you'll succeed. And I want our children to grow up in a world that values learning and opportunity. Charlotte felt tears threatening again. Pregnancy was making her emotional. We'll name the first school after my father, Thomas Finch Academy. Perfect. They returned to the desk together, Charlotte pulling out paper to begin sketching plans. Samuel sat beside her, offering suggestions, helping refine ideas. This was their rhythm now, building things together, making the frontier a little less brutal, a little more just. Around midnight, Samuel noticed Charlotte's eyes drooping. Bed. Now. You're growing a human. You need rest. I'm fine. Charlotte, she sighed but stood. Fine. But tomorrow we start drafting the school charter. Tomorrow, Samuel agreed. As they climbed into bed, Charlotte curled against Samuel's warmth. Outside, the river flowed endlessly, carrying trade and commerce and the pulse of a growing nation. But here, in this moment, she felt only peace. Samuel. Thank you for seeing me. That day in the compound, thank you for seeing a person instead of property. Samuel's arms tightened around her. Thank you for being strong enough to save yourself. I just gave you the chance. Everything else, everything we built, that was you. Us, Charlotte corrected sleepily. We did it together. Together, Samuel agreed. Charlotte drifted towards sleep, thinking of the future stretching before them. Schools to build, children to raise, a business to grow, a territory to help civilize, not through violence but through fairness and opportunity. She'd started as a bonded laborer, worked in chains, been beaten and starved, and told she was nothing. Now she was one of the most powerful people in the Missouri Territory. She'd gone from having no control over her own body to owning half a business empire. But the greatest victory wasn't the wealth or the power. It was lying here, in her own home, beside a man who loved her as an equal, carrying a child who would never know bondage, safe in the knowledge that she'd taken her pain and transformed it into something beautiful. The girl who'd been sold was gone. In her place was a woman who'd bought her own freedom and then used it to free others. Charlotte Finch Grant fell asleep smiling, dreaming of balance sheets and school bells and the children who would someday read by lamplight in buildings that bore her father's name, never knowing how much their education had cost or how completely it had been earned. The poor woman cured the smallpox outbreak, while the mountain man hunted those who tried to stop her. The first victim was a child named Samuel Hutchins, 7 years old, who woke on a cool October morning in 1822 with a fever that made his mother weep. By evening, the telltale pustules had begun their cruel march across his small body. Within 3 days, 2 more children fell ill. Within a week, the settlement along the Ohio River, a ramshackle collection of 43 families who called their muddy town Redemption Creek, was gripped by terror. Abigail Hartwell had been expecting this. She'd seen the way illness moved through isolated communities, how it fed on fear and ignorance like a flame feeds on dry timber. At 30 years old, she was not the sort of woman men looked at twice. She was broad-shouldered and heavy, with thick arms strong from grinding medicines and carrying water. Her face was plain, her hands rough and scarred from years of working with herbs and poultices. The women of Redemption Creek whispered that she'd never marry, that no man would want a wife who spent her days elbow deep in the sick and dying. But Abigail didn't care. She'd learned the healing arts from her grandmother, a Cherokee woman named Edsila, who'd married a white trapper and brought her ancient knowledge into a world that feared what it couldn't understand. Adsila had taught her granddaughter about plants that could break fevers, roots that could stop bleeding, and most importantly, though she'd made Abigail swear never to speak of it to the white folk, about the old way of preventing the spotted sickness. The Cherokee had practiced it for generations, Adsila had explained. When smallpox came, they would take the fluid from someone with a mild case and scratch it into the skin of the healthy. Most would sicken only slightly and then never catch the disease again. The white doctors, Adsila said, had finally begun doing the same thing, calling it inoculation and pretending they'd invented it themselves. Abigail had prepared for this moment. In a locked wooden box beneath her cot, she kept glass vials wrapped in cloth, samples carefully preserved from the last outbreak 2 years prior, which had struck a settlement 30 miles upriver. She'd traveled there to help, had seen the devastation, and had quietly collected what she needed, knowing this day would come. Now, as the death toll mounted, she made her decision. She began with the Hutchins family. Young Samuel was past saving. The disease had progressed too far, his small body covered in the confluent pustules that marked the deadliest form. But his sister Mary, 9 years old, showed no symptoms yet. Abigail arrived at their cabin at dawn, her leather satchel heavy with supplies. Mrs. Hutchins answered the door, her eyes red and swollen. "Is it Samuel?" she whispered. Is he? Not yet," Abigail said gently. "But I'm here for Mary. I can protect her." She explained the procedure as simply as she could, though she saw the fear bloom in Mrs. Hutchins's eyes. "You want to give my daughter the disease? You want to make her sick on purpose?" "A small sickness now to prevent a killing sickness later," Abigail said. "It's worked for hundreds of years. My grandmother's people." "Cherokee witchcraft," Mrs. Hutchins spat. "I should have known. Get away from my house." Abigail tried 3 more families that day. Each turned her away. By the end of the week, Samuel Hutchins was dead, along with 2 other children and an elderly man. Mary Hutchins lay dying. Reverend Josiah Blackburn was a tall, severe man with eyes like chips of flint. He'd come west 5 years earlier, bringing his particular brand of fire and brimstone faith to the frontier. He preached that suffering was divine instruction, that illness was God's judgment, and that the righteous need only pray and repent to be saved. When he heard that Abigail Hartwell was attempting to spread the disease deliberately, he called for an emergency town meeting. The settlers gathered in the half-built church on a bitter November evening. Abigail stood at the back, her arms crossed, watching as Blackburn climbed to his makeshift pulpit. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice rolling through the cramped space like thunder. "We are afflicted by a plague of biblical proportions, 17 dead in 3 weeks, our children dying in their beds. And do you know why?" He paused, letting the silence grow heavy. "Because we have allowed sin to take root among us. We have allowed a woman who consorts with savages and practices their heathen ways, to walk among us unchallenged." Heads turned toward Abigail. She felt the weight of their stares but held her ground. "Miss Hartwell," Blackburn continued, pointing a long finger in her direction, "claims she can prevent this disease by deliberately infecting the healthy. She would take the foul matter of sickness and put it into the bodies of our children. This is not healing. This is witchcraft. This is Satan's work." "That's a lie," Abigail said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "I'm trying to save lives. The method is sound. It's been proven. Proven by heathens and savages," Blackburn roared. "We need no help from Cherokee magic. We need prayer. We need repentance. We need to cast out the evil in our midst." "My son is dead because of your prayers," a voice said from the middle of the room. It was Mrs. Hutchins, standing now, her face hollow with grief. "Samuel died while you prayed over him. Maybe we should have listened to her." Blackburn's expression softened into something that might have been sympathy if it hadn't been edged with steel. "Your grief speaks, Sarah, not your reason. The Lord called Samuel home because it was his time. Would you rather he'd been subjected to this woman's experiments? Would you rather he'd died with her devil's poison in his veins? My daughter's dying now, too, Mrs. Hutchins whispered. What if she's right? What if she could have saved them? Then let her prove it, Blackburn said. Let her take the disease into herself. Let her show us this miracle cure works. If she survives, perhaps we'll consider her methods. If not, he shrugged, then God will have rendered his judgment. The trap was beautifully laid. Abigail saw it clearly. If she refused, she was a coward and a fraud. If she accepted, she'd be subjecting herself to a disease that killed 3 in 10 people who caught it naturally. Even if she survived, Blackburn would claim it was God's mercy, not her methods. But before she could respond, a new voice spoke from the doorway. The woman don't need to prove nothing to you people. Thomas McBride filled the church doorway like a bear emerging from hibernation. He was 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and gristle, dressed in buckskins that had seen better years, with a thick red beard shot through with gray and eyes the color of winter ice. He'd arrived in Redemption Creek 3 days earlier, too sick to keep moving, and had taken shelter in an abandoned trapper's shack at the edge of town. Abigail had found him there that morning, shivering with fever, the first pustules beginning to appear on his chest and arms. She'd brought him water and willow bark tea, had cleaned his wounds, he was covered in old scars, and had explained what was happening in the settlement. He had listened without speaking, his pale eyes never leaving her face. Now he stood in the church, one hand resting on the long rifle he carried, the other pressed against the doorframe as if to steady himself. Mr. McBride, Blackburn said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. This is a private town matter. I'm sure you understand. I understand you're about to get a lot more people killed because you're too stupid and proud to listen to someone who actually knows what she's doing, Thomas interrupted. His Scots-Irish accent was thick, roughened by years of living rough. I got the pox. 3 days ago I was like to die. This woman, he gestured at Abigail, she treated me, gave me medicines, kept the fever down, kept me alive. She knows her trade. And yet you're still sick, Blackburn pointed out, still covered in those marks of God's displeasure. I'm sick, but I ain't dead. And I've seen dead men with this disease, Reverend. I've seen it wipe out entire Arapaho camps. I've seen white settlements where they had to burn the bodies in pits because there wasn't anyone left alive to dig graves. If this woman says she can stop that from happening here, seems to me you'd be a fool not to listen. She wants to spread the disease. No, Thomas said, his voice going quiet and hard. She wants to give folks a fighting chance. There's a difference. One you'd see if you pulled your head out of your ass long enough to look. The church erupted in shouting. Blackburn's face went purple with rage. How dare you? This is a house of God. This is a shed with a cross on it, Thomas corrected. And I've seen God's work, Reverend. I've seen mountains that touch the sky and rivers that run 1,000 miles. I've seen buffalo herds so big they take 3 days to pass. Your God and my God might be different things, but I reckon neither of them wants to see children dying when they don't have to. He swayed slightly, and Abigail realized he was sicker than he'd let on. She moved quickly through the crowd, reaching him just as his knees buckled. He was burning with fever, his skin hot enough to feel through his buckskins. Help me get him out of here, she said to no one in particular. No one moved. Let the sinner burn with his fever, Blackburn said. Let him serve as an example of what happens to those who defy God's will. Abigail looked up at the assembled settlers. These people she'd lived among for 5 years, people whose children she'd delivered and whose sick she'd tended. She saw fear in their faces, and anger, and something worse, the eagerness to believe that someone else was to blame for their suffering. Fine, she said quietly. I'll do it myself. She was strong, but Thomas outweighed her by 100 pounds. She managed to get him upright, his arm slung across her shoulders, and half dragged, half carried him toward the door. The crowd parted to let them through, and she felt their eyes on her back like knife points. She got him as far as the church steps before a stone hit her shoulder. Then another struck her hip. She heard Blackburn's voice. "Begone, witch! Take your familiar with you!" More stones flew. Abigail hunched over Thomas, shielding him with her body as rocks pelted her back and head. One caught her above the ear, and she felt blood run hot down her neck. But she kept moving, step by step, until they were past the church and into the darkness beyond. She brought him to her cabin, a small structure she'd built herself, with a root cellar for storing medicines and a loft for drying herbs. She laid him on her bed and worked through the night, fighting his fever, keeping him alive. And while she worked, she heard the sounds of men gathering outside, heard Blackburn's voice, righteous and terrible, calling her Satan's handmaiden, heard the crack of torches being lit. She was still tending to Thomas when they set her cabin on fire. Thomas came to his senses when Abigail poured cold water on his face. Through the haze of fever, he smelled smoke and heard the roar of flames. She was shouting at him, pulling him toward the door, her arms impossibly strong. "Can you walk? We have to move now." He stumbled to his feet, his head spinning. The cabin was filled with smoke, flames licking up the walls. Abigail had a leather bag slung over her shoulder and was dragging a wooden box toward the back window. Thomas picked up the box, heavier than it looked, and followed her through the window as the roof began to collapse behind them. They ran. Thomas's legs felt like water, his lungs burning, but terror gave him strength. Behind them, voices shouted. Someone fired a musket, the ball whining past Thomas's ear. Abigail led him into the woods, along paths only she knew, deeper into the darkness. They ran until Thomas's legs finally gave out, and then she dragged him into a hollow beneath a fallen oak, covering them both with dead leaves and branches. They lay there for hours, listening to the search parties pass nearby. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever spiking again. When he woke near dawn, Abigail was sitting beside him, her face streaked with soot and blood, her eyes dry and hard. "They burned everything," she said quietly. 5 years of work. All my medicines, my grandmother's journals, my equipment. She touched the leather bag beside her. "I managed to save this, the vaccine samples, and the box. It has some basic supplies." Thomas tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. His head pounded, his skin felt too tight, and every muscle ached. "Why'd you save me?" he asked. "Could have left me in the church, saved yourself." "Because you stood up for me when no one else would," she said simply. "Because you were right. There's a difference between spreading disease and giving people a fighting chance." She paused. "And because I'm a healer. It's what I do." Over the next 3 days, as Thomas's fever broke and his strength slowly returned, Abigail told him everything. About her grandmother, about the old ways of preventing smallpox, about how she'd tried to help Redemption Creek and been branded a witch for her efforts. "The worst part," she said on the third night, as they huddled around a small, carefully concealed fire, "is that they're all going to die. The disease is spreading faster now. Without treatment, without prevention, half the settlement will be dead by Christmas." "Then let them die," Thomas said bitterly. "They chose fear over sense. Let them reap what they've sown." "There are children there," Abigail said quietly. "Babies who had no choice. Mothers who were too afraid to go against the reverend. Good people who just didn't know any better." Thomas studied her in the firelight. His fever had passed, leaving him weak but clear-headed. The pustules on his skin were beginning to scab over. He'd survived, which meant he was one of the lucky 7 in 10, but he'd come close enough to death to know what Abigail had saved him from. "You really think you can stop it?" he asked. "This inoculation of yours?" "I know I can," she said, "if people would let me try. The method works. It's not perfect. Some people still get sick, some still die. But the odds are so much better. Instead of 3 in 10 dying, it's maybe 1 in 100. Maybe less. And Blackburn won't let you do it." "Blackburn will burn me at a stake if he catches me," Abigail said flatly. "He's convinced I'm in league with the devil, and he's convinced most of the settlement to believe the same." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Finally he said, "Tell me about this man, everything you know." Over the next hour, Abigail described Reverend Blackburn in detail. His habits, his weaknesses, his hold over the settlement. She described the other leaders, the miller, the blacksmith, the mayor. She described the layout of the town, who lived where, who might be sympathetic. When she finished, Thomas nodded slowly. "I've been running for near on 2 years now," he said. "Got a price on my head in Pennsylvania. They say I killed a man named Silas Garrett in cold blood, shot him over a debt. Truth is, Garrett tried to kill me first, came at me with a knife when I told him I couldn't pay what I owed. I shot him in self-defense, but his brother's a magistrate. Declared me guilty without a trial, put a bounty on my head. Why are you telling me this? Because if I help you, if I go back to that settlement and make them listen to you, I'm risking getting recognized. There's a bounty hunter passed through Redemption Creek about a year back, I heard. Might still be in the area, but I figure," he looked at her directly, "I figure I owe you my life. And I figure those children you're worried about don't deserve to die because their parents are fools. So I'm offering you a deal." "What kind of deal?" "You cure this plague. I'll make sure nobody stops you." They waited until Thomas was fully recovered, which took another week. During that time, the screams started carrying from the settlement on the wind. Abigail heard them at night and wept, knowing what they meant. The disease was reaching its peak, tearing through the population like wildfire. On the morning they prepared to return, Thomas cleaned his rifle and checked his powder. He had hunted while recovering, building up his strength, and had brought down a deer that they'd smoked and preserved. Now he loaded his possessions with methodical care: rifle, 2 pistols, knife, tomahawk, and a wicked-looking Scottish dirk that had belonged to his father. "I won't kill anyone unless I have to," he said, seeing Abigail watch him. "But I need them to know I'm willing to. Fear's the only language some men understand." "I don't want violence," Abigail said. "I just want to help." "And you will. But help needs protection out here. The frontier's not kind to the gentle, Abigail. You know that as well as I do." They approached Redemption Creek from the north, through the woods. What they saw stopped them cold. The settlement was dying. Corpses lay in the street covered with blankets, waiting for burial. The church bell tolled constantly, a death knell that never stopped. Smoke rose from burning buildings, quarantine fires trying to stop the spread. And everywhere, everywhere, were the sick. "Mother of God," Thomas whispered. Abigail's jaw tightened. "We're going to my old cabin, or what's left of it." The cabin had burned to the ground, but the root cellar had survived. Abigail climbed down into it, emerging with relief on her face. "The fire didn't reach here. Some of my supplies are intact, not much, but enough." Gapo. She worked quickly, setting up a makeshift clinic in the ruins. Thomas built a lean-to shelter using salvaged boards and canvas. By sunset, they had a crude but functional medical station. The first visitor came at dawn the next morning. It was Mrs. Hutchins. She looked like a ghost, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. "My Mary's dead," she said without preamble. "Died 3 days ago. Samuel, then Mary, then my husband yesterday. I'm all that's left." "I'm sorry," Abigail said quietly. "Don't be sorry. Help the others." Mrs. Hutchins looked at the medical supplies Abigail was organizing. "The Reverend says you're a witch, says anyone who comes to you will be damned. But I figure," her voice broke, "I figure I'm already damned, lost my whole family. Can't get much worse than that." "It can always get worse," Abigail said gently, "but it can also get better." "Are you sick?" "Not yet." "Then let me protect you. It won't guarantee you won't catch it, but your chances will be much better." Mrs. Hutchins held out her arm. Abigail performed the inoculation carefully, explaining each step. She made a small scratch on Mrs. Hutchins's arm, then applied a tiny amount of the preserved material from her glass vials. She bandaged it carefully and gave strict instructions for care. You'll likely get a small fever in a few days, she explained. Maybe a few pustules around the scratch. That's normal. It means it's working. But if you get sicker than that, you come straight back here. Mrs. Hutchins nodded. As she turned to leave, she paused. The Reverend's going to find out. He has people watching. When he does, he'll have to go through me, Thomas said from where he sat cleaning his rifle. Mrs. Hutchins looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and left. The second person came an hour later, then a third, then a fourth. Word spread quickly. The witch had returned, and she was offering protection from the plague. Reverend Blackburn heard about it by noon. Blackburn came with 20 men, all armed. They formed a semicircle around the ruined cabin, muskets and pistols at the ready. The Reverend himself stood at the center, his face twisted with righteous fury. "Abigail Hartwell," he shouted, "you have defied God's will and the laws of this settlement. You have practiced witchcraft and devil worship. You have returned to spread your evil despite being cast out. I am placing you under citizen's arrest." Abigail stepped out of the lean-to, her hands empty, her face calm. Behind her, Thomas emerged, his rifle held loosely but ready. "I'm not practicing witchcraft, Reverend," Abigail said. "I'm practicing medicine, and I'm saving lives." "You're spreading disease," Blackburn roared. "These good people have told me you've been deliberately infecting them." "I've been inoculating them," Abigail corrected. "It's different. I've explained this. I'll hear no more of your lies." Blackburn turned to his men. "Take her, and if that mountain man interferes, shoot him." Thomas moved faster than Abigail would have thought possible for a man his size. He stepped in front of her, his rifle coming up to his shoulder, aimed directly at Blackburn's chest. "Anyone who stops her from saving lives will answer to me," he said quietly. The armed men hesitated. Thomas's reputation had preceded him. Stories of mountain men filtered down from the high country, tales of men who could shoot the eye out of an eagle at 100 yards, who could track a ghost and fight like devils. And this man, this enormous red-bearded stranger, had the look of someone who'd done considerable violence in his life and wouldn't hesitate to do more. "You'd murder a man of God?" Blackburn demanded, though his voice shook slightly. "I'd kill a man who's letting children die out of pride and ignorance," Thomas corrected. "Whether he's a man of God or not don't matter to me. What matters is those folks lying sick in their beds, dying because you won't let this woman help them." "She's infecting them." "She's protecting them," Thomas said. "And here's what's going to happen. You and your men are going to turn around and walk away. You're going to let Miss Hartwell do her work. And if she saves lives, when she saves lives, you're going to admit you were wrong." "Never." "Then I guess we have a problem." The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. 20 guns against one, but that one belonged to a man who looked very comfortable with death. Finally, one of Blackburn's men, the blacksmith, a practical man named Garrett, lowered his musket. "Reverend," he said quietly, "my wife's sick, my 2 boys too. If there's even a chance this woman can help them." "She's a witch, Garrett. She'll damn their souls." "Their souls won't matter much if they're dead," Garrett said flatly. He looked at Abigail. "Ma'am, can you help my family?" "I can try," Abigail said. "That's good enough for me." Garrett turned and walked away. 2 other men followed him. Blackburn's face went purple with rage. "Traitors! Fools! You'll burn in hell for this!" "Rather burn later than watch my family die now," Garrett called back. Slowly, reluctantly, the other armed men began to drift away. Some still looked at Abigail with fear and suspicion, but more looked at her with desperate hope. Their families were dying, their children were suffering. They'd tried prayer, and prayer hadn't worked. Finally, only Blackburn remained, standing alone in the clearing, his hands clenched into fists. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. "I know what you are, woman. I know the evil that lives in you, and I will prove it to everyone. Mark my words, you'll hang for this." He turned and stalked away. and Thomas lowered his rifle but didn't uncock it. That man's going to be a problem. He already is, Abigail said, but she was looking at the line of people forming near her lean-to, desperate faces, hopeful faces. She felt something fierce and bright kindle in her chest. She had work to do. For the next 3 weeks, Abigail worked without rest. Thomas stood guard, watching the approaches to their camp, making sure no one interfered. People came in a steady stream, mothers carrying sick children, men too proud to ask for help until desperation broke them, elderly folks who'd survived one plague and didn't want to die of another. Abigail inoculated the healthy and treated the sick. She mixed medicines, administered treatments, and explained over and over how the process worked. Some understood, many didn't, but most were willing to try. Thomas watched her with growing respect. She moved among the sick without fear, cleaning suppurating wounds, spooning medicine into unwilling mouths, holding the hands of the dying when there was nothing else she could do. She slept 3 hours a night, ate when she remembered to, and never complained. "You're going to work yourself to death," he told her one evening as she ground herbs by lamplight, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "Better than watching others die while I do nothing," she said. He brought her food, made sure she drank water, and once, when she finally collapsed from sheer exhaustion, carried her to the lean-to and stood watch over her while she slept for 16 hours straight. The results began to show within a week. Those who'd been inoculated early developed mild fevers and small clusters of pustules, then recovered. The naturally infected continued to die, but at a slower rate as the disease burned through the susceptible population. And crucially, the children of inoculated parents stopped falling sick. Mrs. Hutchins was the first to publicly thank Abigail. She stood in the settlement's common area and announced loudly that the woman they'd called a witch had saved her life. Garrett, the blacksmith's family, all survived. His wife and 2 boys developed only mild cases and recovered quickly. Other voices joined the chorus of support, but Reverend Blackburn refused to concede. He preached fire and brimstone, declaring that those who'd accepted the devil's cure had imperiled their immortal souls. He pointed to those who still died, because some did, no treatment was perfect, as proof of God's judgment. Thomas noticed that Blackburn's sermons were getting stranger, more frantic. The Reverend looked haggard, slept poorly, and had begun drinking heavily. Something was eating at him, some guilt or fear that manifested in increasingly wild accusations. "He's hiding something," Thomas told Abigail. "A man don't act like that unless he's got secrets." "Everyone has secrets," Abigail said tiredly. "Right now, I'm more concerned about keeping people alive than worrying about Blackburn's conscience." But Thomas couldn't let it go. He developed an instinct for duplicity during his years in the wilderness, trading with men who'd smile while planning to cut your throat. Blackburn had that same oily quality, that same false piety that masked something rotten underneath. One night, while Abigail slept, Thomas broke into the church. The church was dark and cold. Thomas moved silently, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, just that bone-deep certainty that Blackburn was hiding something. He searched the Reverend's private quarters, a small room behind the pulpit. Blackburn lived Spartanly, a narrow bed, a writing desk, a chest for clothes. But in the desk drawer, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath a false bottom, Thomas found letters. He carried them to the window where moonlight fell through, and read by the pale silver glow. The first few letters were mundane, correspondence with other ministers, discussions of theology and frontier politics. But then Thomas found a letter from a trading post 300 miles north, dated 6 months earlier. "Reverend Blackburn, we received your inquiry about the blankets and winter goods. Yes, we have surplus stock available at reduced prices due to the recent unfortunate events at our post. Smallpox struck us hard this spring. Lost near 40 souls, mostly Indians, who'd camped nearby for trading. We have good wool blankets, hardly used, selling for half the usual price if you're interested. The sickness is past, so no concern about contamination." Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. He kept reading. Another letter, this one Blackburn's response. "I will take 50 blankets at the price you've quoted. Send them downriver with the next supply boat. I intend to distribute them as charity to my congregation, a gesture of Christian kindness as winter approaches." And then, most damning, a note in Blackburn's own hand, dated 2 weeks before the first case of smallpox appeared in Redemption Creek. Sold 47 blankets to various families, kept 3 for church use, excellent profit, bought for $2 each, sold for $8. The Lord provides for those who are wise in commerce. If questioned about the source, say they were donated by a wealthy benefactor in Philadelphia. Thomas stared at the letters, his hands shaking. Blackburn had knowingly bought contaminated blankets from a plague-stricken fort. He had sold them to his own congregation for profit. And when the disease inevitably spread, when people started dying from the very illness he'd introduced, he'd blamed it on God's judgment and attacked the one person trying to stop it. "You son of a bitch," Thomas whispered. He took the letters and left the church as silently as he had entered. By the time he reached the lean-to, dawn was breaking. Abigail was already awake, preparing for another day of treatment. "Thomas? Where have you been?" He handed her the letters without speaking. She read them once, then again, her face growing pale. "He brought the disease here. He killed those people. He killed children for $8 per blanket. And then blamed you for it," Thomas said. "Tried to have you killed to cover his tracks." Abigail sat down heavily, the letters clutched in her hands. Thomas could see her mind working, processing the implications. Finally, she looked up at him. "We have to tell everyone." "Aye, but we do it smart. Blackburn's still got supporters, folks who'd rather believe a comforting lie than an ugly truth. If we just start making accusations, he'll call us liars and turn people against us." "Then what do you suggest?" Thomas thought for a moment. "Church services are tomorrow morning, aye? Everyone will be there. We confront him publicly with evidence. Make him answer for what he's done in front of the whole settlement." "That could get us killed." "Could," Thomas agreed. "But I'm thinking his supporters might have second thoughts when they learn he murdered their families for profit." Abigail looked at the letters again, at the damning evidence of Blackburn's greed and corruption. "All right," she said quietly. "Tomorrow. But Thomas, no killing, even if he deserves it." "I make no promises," Thomas said, "but I'll try." Sunday morning dawned cold and clear. The church was packed, more people than had attended services in months. Word had spread that something important was happening, though no one knew quite what. Reverend Blackburn stood at his pulpit, looking gaunt and feverish. He'd been drinking. Thomas could tell from the way he swayed slightly, the way his eyes were too bright and unfocused. The Reverend began his sermon with his usual fire. "Brothers and sisters, we are being tested. God has sent this plague to separate the righteous from the wicked, to punish those who turn from his light, and there are those among us." He pointed dramatically toward the back of the church, where Abigail and Thomas stood. "Who would lead you astray? Who would have you trust in devil's magic instead of the Lord's mercy?" "That's interesting," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "Because I have some questions about this plague, Reverend, specifically about where it came from." Blackburn's face flushed. "It came from sin, from wickedness, It came from you," Thomas interrupted. He began walking down the aisle, the letters held in his hand. "It came from 50 contaminated blankets you bought from a plague-stricken trading post and sold to your congregation for profit." The church erupted in confused murmurs. Blackburn gripped his pulpit. "That's a lie. That's slander." "Is it?" Thomas reached the front of the church and held up the letters. "These are your own words, Reverend, your own hand. Shall I read them to your congregation?" Those are private correspondence. You had no right." "I had every right," Thomas said coldly. "You tried to kill an innocent woman. You let children die to cover your crimes. You murdered 17 people, so far, for $8 a blanket." He began reading the letters aloud. The church fell silent except for his voice and the terrible, damning words of Blackburn's own confession. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Then Mrs. Hutchins stood up. "My Samuel," she whispered, "my Mary, they died because you sold us those blankets." "I didn't know they were contaminated," Blackburn shouted desperately. "I thought the disease had passed. You thought you could make a profit," Abigail said, speaking for the first time. She stepped forward to stand beside Thomas. "The letter specifically mentions contamination. You knew, you just didn't care." Garrett the blacksmith stood up, his face dark with fury. "My wife almost died. My boys almost died. And you—" He started toward the pulpit, murder in his eyes. Other men rose, anger rippling through the congregation like wildfire. Blackburn backed away, his face white with terror. "Wait!" he screamed. "You can't! I'm a man of God! You can't—" "You're a murderer," Thomas said flatly, "and a coward, and a liar." The crowd surged forward. Blackburn ran, pushing past Thomas, sprinting for the door. He made it 3 steps outside before Garrett tackled him to the muddy ground. What followed wasn't pretty. The crowd surrounded Blackburn, shouting, demanding justice. Some wanted him hanged immediately. Others wanted to let him suffer from the disease he'd spread. Rough frontier justice. It was Abigail who stopped it. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough killing! Haven't we had enough death?" The crowd turned to look at her, and she continued, her voice shaking but determined. "Blackburn is guilty. He killed 17 people through negligence and greed. But we're not murderers. We're not savages. We have laws, even out here." "What do you suggest?" Garrett asked. "Let him go?" "No. We hold a trial, a real trial. We present the evidence, let him defend himself if he can, and then we decide his punishment according to law." Thomas expected the crowd to reject this. Frontier justice was usually swift and brutal. But Abigail's words carried weight. She'd saved their lives, their children's lives. They respected her. The trial was held that afternoon in the church. A jury of 12 men was selected. Thomas testified about finding the letters. Abigail testified about the timeline of the disease. Other witnesses came forward, people who'd bought blankets from Blackburn, people who could confirm when they'd first gotten sick. Blackburn tried to defend himself, claiming ignorance, claiming he'd been trying to help. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict: guilty of manslaughter and fraud. The sentence: exile. Blackburn would be stripped of all his possessions, given 3 days of supplies, and forced to leave Redemption Creek forever. If he ever returned, he would hang. They marched him out of town at sunset. Thomas escorted him personally, making sure he understood the terms. At the edge of the settlement, Blackburn turned back one last time. "You think you've won," he spat at Thomas, "but mark my words, that woman is still a witch. She still practices dark arts. Someday, someone will see through her lies." "Maybe," Thomas said, "but it won't be you. Get moving. And Blackburn?" He leaned in close. "If I ever see your face again, I won't wait for a trial. I'll put a bullet between your eyes and sleep fine that night. Understand?" Blackburn's face went white. He nodded and stumbled off into the wilderness. Thomas watched him go until he was out of sight, then turned and walked back to Redemption Creek. The weeks that followed were hard but hopeful. With Blackburn gone and the truth revealed, Abigail's work became easier. People came to her freely now, without fear or shame. She inoculated everyone who hadn't been exposed yet, and treated the sick with renewed determination. The death toll stopped rising. By Christmas, the plague had run its course. 23 dead in total, terrible, but far less than it could have been. Entire settlements had been wiped out by smallpox before. Redemption Creek had survived. During the long winter, as the settlement rebuilt and healed, Thomas found himself spending more and more time with Abigail. At first, it was practical. He helped her gather medicinal plants, hunted to keep her fed while she worked, built a proper cabin to replace the one that had burned. But gradually, it became something more. He'd never been a man comfortable with words or feelings. The wilderness had been his home for 20 years, and solitude his companion. But Abigail drew him out. They talked by firelight about everything and nothing. Her grandmother's teachings, his years in the mountains, dreams and fears and memories. One night in January, as snow fell outside the new cabin, Abigail asked him about the price on his head. "Do you think you'll ever be able to clear your name?" Thomas shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. Garrett's brother is powerful. He wants me dead or in prison. Long as he's alive, I'm a wanted man." "So you'll run forever?" "I've been running 2 years. Can run a lot longer if I have to." He paused. "But I'm thinking, maybe I'm tired of running." "What would you do instead?" He looked at her directly. "I'm thinking I might stay here. Help you with your work, if you'll have me." Abigail was quiet for a long moment. "Thomas, I'm not the kind of woman men court. I'm too plain, too heavy, too focused on my work. I don't—" "You're the strongest person I've ever met," Thomas interrupted. "Man or woman. You stood up to an entire town when they tried to burn you as a witch. You risked everything to save people who hated you. You're brilliant and kind and stubborn as a mule." He smiled slightly. "And I'm thinking I love you. Have for a while now." Abigail stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "You... what?" "Love you," Thomas repeated simply, "if that's something you can tolerate." She laughed then, a startled sound that became a sob, and then she was crying and laughing at the same time. Thomas pulled her into his arms, this fierce woman who'd stolen his heart without even trying, and held her while she wept. "Yes," she said when she could speak again. "Yes, I can tolerate that. And Thomas, I love you too." They were married in March, in the same church where Blackburn had tried to condemn her. The entire settlement attended. Mrs. Hutchins wept through the whole ceremony. Garrett gave Abigail away, having appointed himself her surrogate father. But their work was far from finished. Spring brought new challenges. Word of Abigail's success had spread to neighboring settlements. People began arriving from miles away, seeking her help with illnesses, begging her to teach them her methods. Some came on foot, others on horseback, a few by boat along the river. One visitor was different. Her name was Elizabeth Morrison, and she was the daughter of a Philadelphia doctor. She'd traveled west with her husband, a surveyor, and had heard about the miracle healer of Redemption Creek. "I want to learn," Elizabeth told Abigail bluntly. "My father taught me some medicine, but he wouldn't teach me everything. Said it wasn't proper for a woman. But I'm not asking for proper. I'm asking for useful." Abigail studied the young woman. She couldn't have been more than 22, with sharp eyes and capable hands. "Can you stomach blood and pus? Can you work with the dying and not flinch?" "I've birthed 3 babies on the trail west," Elizabeth said. "1 breech, 1 stillborn, 1 survived against all odds. I can stomach whatever you can teach me." "Then you're welcome here." Elizabeth was the first, but not the last. Over the next year, 6 more women came to study with Abigail. Some were doctors' daughters like Elizabeth, others were midwives or healers in their own right. All of them hungry to learn, all of them frustrated by a society that said healing was men's work. Thomas built them a larger building, part clinic, part school. The women studied during the day, practicing techniques on willing patients from the settlement and surrounding areas. Abigail taught them everything her grandmother had taught her, plus everything she'd learned on her own. Inoculation techniques, herbal medicines, wound treatment, childbirth, fever management. Thomas appointed himself their protector. When a drunk trapper tried to assault one of the students, Thomas broke the man's arm and escorted him 20 miles into the wilderness with a warning never to return. When a circuit preacher came through denouncing the school as unnatural and against God's order, Thomas had a long conversation with him about respecting women's work. The preacher left hastily and didn't come back. The bounty hunters came in the second year. There were 3 of them, hard men with cold eyes and well-maintained weapons. They rode into Redemption Creek on a hot July afternoon, asking questions about a mountain man with a red beard and a price on his head. Garrett sent his son running to warn Thomas. Thomas was at the school, helping Abigail prepare a shipment of medicine to send downriver. When the boy burst in with the news, Thomas felt his stomach drop. "How many?" "3, Mr. McBride, armed to the teeth. They're at the tavern now, asking around." Thomas looked at Abigail. She'd gone pale, but her jaw was set. "Run," she said. "Go now while you can." "I'm not running anymore," Thomas said quietly. "I'm tired of it. They'll kill you or drag you back to Pennsylvania to hang. Maybe. Or maybe it's time I stood and fought for something instead of running." He checked his weapons, kissed Abigail quickly, and walked out to meet his fate. The bounty hunters were waiting in the settlement square. The largest one, a bear of a man with a scarred face, grinned when he saw Thomas approach. "Thomas McBride, been looking for you for near on 2 years. You're a hard man to track." "What do you want?" Thomas asked, though he knew the answer. "You know what we want. Dead or alive, the warrant says. Dead's easier, but alive pays better. Your choice." Thomas shook his head. "I didn't murder Silas Garrett. It was self-defense. The man came at me with a knife." "So you say. Judge said different. Now, you coming peaceful, or do we have to make this ugly?" Before Thomas could answer, Garrett stepped out of the crowd that had gathered, then Mrs. Hutchins, then Elizabeth Morrison and the other students. Then dozens of other settlers, forming a wall between Thomas and the bounty hunters. "Mr. McBride ain't going nowhere," Garrett said flatly. "He's a respected member of this community, saved lives during the plague, protected our healer, helped build our school." The scarred bounty hunter laughed. "That's real touching, but the law's the law. Man's got a price on his head we're collecting." "The law," Abigail said, stepping forward, "is supposed to be about justice. Thomas killed a man in self-defense. He's guilty of nothing but surviving." "Ma'am, with all respect, that ain't for you to decide." "Then who decides?" Abigail demanded. "A corrupt magistrate in Pennsylvania? A rich man's brother who wants revenge? Where's the justice in that?" The bounty hunter's expression hardened. "Step aside, lady, all of you. We don't want to hurt anyone, but we will if we have to." "No," Abigail said simply. "You're not taking him." The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, the scarred bounty hunter sighed and drew his pistol. Last chance. Thomas moved before anyone else could react. He stepped in front of Abigail, his rifle coming up, and fired in one smooth motion. The scarred bounty hunter went down with a bullet through his shoulder, painful but not fatal. The other 2 hunters grabbed for their weapons. Thomas dropped his rifle and drew his pistols, and suddenly the square erupted in chaos. Garrett and several other men rushed the bounty hunters, tackling them before they could fire. Women screamed, children scattered. In the confusion, Thomas found himself on top of one of the hunters, his fist driving into the man's face again and again until strong hands pulled him off. When the dust settled, all 3 bounty hunters were disarmed and bound. The scarred one was bleeding heavily from his shoulder wound. Abigail, despite everything, went to treat him. "Why?" the hunter gasped as she cleaned and bandaged his wound. "We were going to kill your man." "Because I'm a healer," Abigail said simply. "It's what I do." The settlement held another trial. This time, the accused were the bounty hunters, charged with attempted murder and disturbing the peace. Thomas testified about the events in Pennsylvania, about Garrett's attack, about the corrupt magistrate. And then something unexpected happened. One of the bounty hunters, the youngest, barely 20, broke down and confessed. "It's all bullshit," he sobbed. "Silas Garrett's brother paid us to kill McBride, not arrest him. Said to make it look legal, but really he just wants revenge for his brother dying. There ain't no real warrant. We made it up." The courtroom erupted. Thomas felt his knees go weak. "So I'm not wanted?" he asked. "Never were," the young hunter said. "Just a grudge and some paid killers. I'm sorry. I needed the money and I didn't think about what I was doing." The scarred hunter glared at his young companion, but said nothing. The verdict came swiftly. The bounty hunters would be stripped of their weapons and possessions, given minimal supplies, and sent away with the same warning Blackburn had received: return and face execution. Thomas watched them go, his mind still reeling. 2 years of running, 2 years of looking over his shoulder, and it had all been a lie. Abigail took his hand. "You're free," she said softly. "I," Thomas said, "free."